Hey, Pastor Rick here. So glad that you're with us, and we're going to wrap up our series on real relationships. And I've been telling this talk, grieving in relationships. Grieving in relationships. What I want to do is to wrap this up. Put a picture up there. Rick, is that a grave? It is. It is. I want to talk about grieving in relationships, about death in relationships, because here's the reality is that loss and grief are a part of the human experience, and therefore they are a part of our relationships, our relational experience. See, loss marks the place where self-knowledge and powerful transformation can happen if we have the courage to participate in this process. Loss is a part of life. Another way of saying it is, well, we don't like it. We don't like it. I don't like it, okay? But the reality is, it is a part of our human experience for every single one of us. And the reality is, it's going to be a reality in many of our relationships as well. Limits, by the way, are a part of loss. Limits are behind all losses. What do I mean by that? I think God has placed limits, even around the most gifted of us, to keep us humble and to have a proper perspective that ultimately death is central to life. What do you mean, Rick? Let me give you some examples, okay? We will all lose our youthfulness, okay, one day. There's no amount of plastic surgery. There's no amount of cosmetics, of makeup, of good dieting and exercise to stop the process of growing older. Now, some of that stuff might help, but the reality is we will grow old and even move from this life to the next. We also, limits. How many of us have ever lost dreams? We all lose our dreams. Could be dreams of a career, a dream of a certain type of success in career. It could be even our dreams of what we thought marriage was supposed to be, or how our children are supposed to turn out. See, so many of our hopes, again, no one wants to hear this, but it's a reality. There's death in our hopes. Some dreams die. We lose our stability in relationships by transitions. Each time we change jobs, each time we change churches, we move to a different part of the country, or we change or even lose friends, which has happened a lot, it seems like, as the culture gets more and more polarized. There's a death aspect. There's a losing aspect because our limits, we can't control. We can't control people. We can't control time and the aging process. Some of us experience moments of incredible relational loss, unexpected deaths. A friend commits suicide, or a nephew. A spouse has an affair, or we find ourselves single after a difficult divorce or breakup. Loss, the death of what we thought we had. Every person who lives in community with other people, you need to be a Christian if you're listening to me right now, that we suffer loss. But as a Christian, sooner or later, you're going to experience broken relationships and the grief that comes with it. And here's the reality. I wrote in my notes, we don't expect it, and most of us have certainly not been given training on how to deal with loss in relationships, grieving in relationships appropriately. And as a result, we deal with our pain how? We numb it, deny it, we rationalize, we blame others, we're involved in addictions or avoidance. We search for spiritual shortcuts in our approach to heal our relational wounds, and yet it doesn't work. The choice is this. Will these hurts and pains, the grief that we experience, crush our spirits and life and relationships in the future, or will they open us up to new possibilities in the depths of our journey with Jesus and others? The heart of Christianity is that the way of life is through death. I mean, the very heart of Christianity is this. Over and over again, I want you to think about this. That the way of real life, to save your life, is to lose it, Jesus said one way, is through death. The pathway to the resurrection, we're going to talk about Easter here in just a couple of weeks, starting next week, is through the crucifixion. The way to life is through death. Gerald Sittser, in his book, A Grace Disguised, one of his quotes is this in his book, is that the quickest way to reach the sun and the light of day is not to run west by chasing after the light. Instead, it's to head east into the darkness until you finally reach the sunrise. Just let that sit for a second. It's the opposite of what the culture teaches. It's the opposite of what Christian culture teaches. It's the opposite of what we believe instinctually. But Job models for us, I love his story, brilliantly, how to grieve when it comes to all kinds of death, including death in relationships. So I want to just give you a couple of, there's verbiage here, some steps, kind of put them 1 through, I think, 5, ways to kind of work through the grief and the loss that you have, or that you will one day experience in relationships, the death of relationships. How do you get through? Here's how you do it. Number 1, you got to first pay attention. You can't numb it away. You can't get so busy. You can't just deny it or minimize it. And again, I'll say it this way. In the church today, big C, we have a little theology for anger. We have little theology and compassion for sadness, for depression, for waiting, for anxiety. Most of us, even as Christians, we should know better to some extent. We wear a mask. How are you doing? Fine, just fine. And I'm not saying you should go around, I've never said this, that you go around and just bare your soul, to every human being you come into contact with, as you're working through some of these things. But do you have a few trusted individuals that you can be real with, authentic with? But part of it starts with you got to pay attention. You can't deny it. You got to pay attention. What is going on inside of you? Now, Job's misery lasted for months, maybe even several years. We just don't know, but we do know this. Thankfully, Job paid attention to God himself, his inner world, choosing to enter, thankfully, the confusion of his personal dark night of his soul. It's all captured there in the book of Job. Rather than to medicate or run away. We can learn so much from his decisions all these years later. So you got to pay attention. You got to be willing to kind of not only pay attention to what's maybe going on, but you've also got to wait. And again, waiting is not passive. Wait in this confusing, I'm going to call it, for lack of a better term, in between time and in the difficulty of relationships or life for you. And I tell you what, I don't know about you, I can't stand waiting. Airports, checkout lines at the grocery store, traffic, Some of you, if you live in an urban center, subways. But one of the greatest struggles for us as human beings, and even for Christ followers, is waiting for God when things are confusing. Maybe that's why we're taught really in Scripture to just simply be with those who are mourning. Oftentimes people ask me, what can I do, Rick? What can I do if people are hurting? I just be with them. Just listen to them. Cry with them. Don't judge them. Don't try to fix them. Just love on them. But see, the reality is we have such an aversion to the limits that God places on us. And that's why we struggle with waiting. Waiting is all of a sudden realizing we don't control this. Whether it's a relationship, whether it's a medical diagnosis that impacts relationships, whether it's transition at work, retirement, people at church, whatever it is, we have such an aversion to limits that God places on us because we haven't been taught this and we haven't been taught to embrace this. But in Job, we learn to embrace the gifts of limits. The greatest loss we must grieve, I am more and more convinced as I get older, is grieving. It's the hardest, is to grieve our own personal limits. It drives us to such deep humility before God and others like nothing else. Job was a great man, but he was not God. And ultimately, in this whole story, like your story, like my story, he has to learn to embrace his limits. And I think one of the great tasks of leadership, even parenting, is to help others accept and embrace limits. And Job learned that. Have you? Have I? Difficulties and pain and suffering and grieving and relationship grieving teach us that. And it's taught me this as a pastor for 24 years. Job also learned to climb the ladder of humility. I mean, Job emerged from all of this, if you ever get a chance to read this book all the way through. At the end of the story, from his pain and his suffering, he emerged from it transformed. He was broken, but he was truly a changed man, changed from the inside out. And after his great loss and his long waiting, embracing his limits, God spoke to Job. And you can look on your own. Job 42, he calls Job his servant. That's a different title he starts to call Job. There's this intimate relationship. There's a closeness to God that Job has. And you see in the way he's transforming. He could have taken revenge on his friends. Instead, he chose to pray for them and to bless them. Kind of like Jesus said to do centuries and centuries later, to bless your enemies, love those who curse you. Throughout this difficult time of waiting, Job climbed this ladder of humility. And again, humility is so indispensable as a quality for maturing in Jesus Christ. And that's why Jesus said things like this in his teaching all the time. For those who tend to exalt themselves, their massive egos and narcissisms, they will be humbled. But those who are truly humble will themselves be exhausted. Now, this ladder of humility, I'm going to give you as a tool. And I'm not going to go through it, but it's going to be there if you go to our app and our message section. In this message, a place for discussion notes, for reflection, for small groups, you will find this. Lori promised me that it will be available after you see this as a way to use a tool of how to climb this ladder of humility. Well, lastly, as I got to wrap this up, is not only do we have to embrace our limits and pay attention and all of this, but we've got to allow this process to happen so the old can birth out the new. Good grieving is not just surrendering and letting go, as I've learned, as Job learned, but it's also letting God bless you in the process. Job did this. There was a finality when it came to his grieving and loss, and God blessed him even in spite and through the pain. This is the story and the lesson of Job. The lesson of Job is this. As he followed this difficult path of allowing his grief, his loss, his death, and his relationships to enlarge his soul for God. And God blessed him. That's the choice we have. And it's so counterintuitive. It is so against the grain of culture and even our culture and most of Christianity in our churches. It's to run to light versus run towards the darkness. But the story of Job encourages us to trust the living God with the many, many deaths that we will experience in our lifetime. We should never be surprised. Jesus said, "For take heart, in this world you will have trouble." Why are we surprised? When there's brokenness and pain and relationship loss. We got to be encouraged and remember, the central message of Jesus Christ is the suffering and death that bring about the resurrection is through the crucifixion. That suffering and death bring resurrection and transformation. And we're going to talk about this over the next couple of weeks because that's the beautiful story of Easter. And so with Job, he encourages us to trust in the living God, even in relationship loss and difficulty. Maybe one way to wrap this up is Jesus said this way, "Very truly I tell you," in John 12:24, "unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But when it dies, and if it dies, it can produce many, many seeds." I love that. It's a reminder that no matter what you're going through, no matter what I'm going through, if I allow God, like Job did in this process, in any kind of death, but especially relational death and the many deaths that you've already experienced and you're going to experience. Betrayal, hurt, brokenness, fragmentation, marriage, family, church life, community, work. You can't run from it. Can't deny it. You can. Will lead to all kinds of unhealthiness. Or you could allow God, like Job, to use it as even a blessing in this life, so it can produce fruit in your life and in your current relationships. That's what I want to encourage you with today.